Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR Spoiler Today channel. Please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The tension in Genoa City had been building for days, an invisible storm crackling beneath polite conversations and forced smiles, but no one could have predicted just how violently it would erupt when Phyllis finally came face to face with Tessa. It began quietly enough, too quietly, in fact, which should have been the first warning sign. Phyllis had that unmistakable look in her eyes, the one that meant she already knew everything, even before a single word had been spoken. Tessa, sensing the shift in the air, tried to keep her composure, but the weight of the secret she had been carrying pressed heavily on her chest, making it nearly impossible to breathe. She had convinced herself she could keep it buried, that no one would ever find out the truth, but standing there in front of Phyllis, she realized just how wrong she had been. The moment stretched painfully, the silence louder than any argument, until Phyllis finally stepped forward, her voice low and dangerously calm as she demanded answers. Tessa hesitated, just for a second, but that was all it took to confirm Phyllis's suspicions. And then it happened. The slap echoed through the room, sharp and shocking, freezing time itself as Tessa staggered back, her hand flying to her cheek in disbelief. It wasn't just the pain that stunned her, it was the fury behind it, the sheer intensity of Phyllis's rage, which seemed to consume everything in its path. Phyllis didn't stop there. Her words came fast and venomous, each one cutting deeper than the last as she unleashed everything she had been holding back. She accused Tessa of betrayal, of deception, of playing a dangerous game with people's lives, and the more she spoke, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about a secret, it was about the consequences that secret carried. Tessa tried to defend herself, her voice trembling as she insisted she had her reasons, that things weren't as simple as they seemed, but Phyllis wasn't interested in explanations. In her mind, the damage had already been done, and there was no excuse that could undo it. The confrontation escalated quickly, emotions spiraling out of control as Phyllis stepped even closer, her presence overwhelming, her anger almost palpable. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper that sent a shiver down Tessa's spine. "Tell anyone, and your life is over." It wasn't an empty threat. There was something in Phyllis's eyes, something dark and unyielding, that made it clear she meant every word. Tessa felt the world closing in around her, the walls of her carefully constructed reality crumbling under the weight of exposure. She had always known the truth could come out eventually, but she hadn't expected it to happen like this, in such a brutal and public way. And worse, she hadn't anticipated just how far Phyllis would be willing to go to keep things under control. Fear began to replace her initial shock, creeping into her thoughts as she realized the danger she was now in. Phyllis wasn't just angry, she was desperate, and desperation made people unpredictable. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier, as the gravity of the situation settled over both of them. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of something else in Phyllis's expression, pain, perhaps, or even regret, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced once again by steely determination. Outside, the ripple effects of the confrontation were already beginning to spread. Genoa City had a way of sensing when something was off, and whispers started to circulate almost immediately. People noticed the tension, the way Tessa avoided eye contact, the way Phyllis carried herself with an almost unsettling confidence, as if daring anyone to question her. It didn't take long for speculation to turn into suspicion, and for suspicion to evolve into rumors. Everyone wanted to know what had happened, what secret could possibly have triggered such a violent reaction. But neither Phyllis nor Tessa were talking, not yet, at least. They were both locked in a silent standoff, each waiting to see what the other would do next. As the hours passed, Tessa found herself replaying the moment over and over again, the sound of the slap echoing in her mind, the threat ringing in her ears. She knew she was standing at a crossroads. She could stay silent, protect herself, and hope that the situation would somehow resolve itself, or she could tell the truth and risk everything. The choice wasn't as simple as it seemed. Because this wasn't just about her anymore, it was about everyone connected to the secret she had been hiding. Lives could be destroyed, relationships shattered, reputations ruined. And yet, the idea of living under Phyllis's control, constantly looking over her shoulder, was equally unbearable. Meanwhile, Phyllis was dealing with her own internal battle. Despite her outward confidence, she knew the situation was far from stable. Threatening Tessa had been a calculated move, but it was also a risky one. If Tessa decided to talk, there was no guarantee Phyllis would be able to contain the fallout. And deep down, she understood that secrets had a way of surfacing no matter how hard you tried to bury them. Still, she wasn't ready to back down. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. She convinced herself that she was doing what needed to be done, that her actions were justified, even necessary. But the doubt lingered, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise. The days that followed were filled with tension and uncertainty, each interaction loaded with unspoken meaning. Tessa became increasingly withdrawn, her usual warmth replaced by a guarded demeanor that didn't go unnoticed by those closest to her. Questions were asked, concerns were raised, but she deflected them all, unwilling to reveal what had happened. Phyllis, on the other hand, doubled down on her efforts to maintain control, carefully monitoring the situation, always one step ahead, or so she believed. But the truth was, the balance was fragile and it wouldn't take much to tip it. And then came the moment that changed everything. It was subtle at first, a look, a hesitation, a crack in the carefully constructed facade, but it was enough. Someone noticed. Someone started to piece things together. And just like that, the secret that had caused so much chaos began to unravel, thread by thread. The threat that Phyllis had issued suddenly seemed less like a solution and more like a ticking time bomb. Because once the truth started to come out, there would be no stopping it. In Genoa City, secrets never stayed buried forever. And when they came to light, they didn't just affect the people directly involved, they sent shockwaves through the entire community. The confrontation between Phyllis and Tessa was just the beginning, the spark that ignited a much larger explosion. The real question wasn't whether the truth would come out, it was what would happen when it did. Because in a place where loyalty was fragile and betrayal ran deep, the consequences could be devastating. As the storm continued to build, one thing became painfully clear, there was no going back. The slap, the threat, the secret, it had all set something in motion that couldn't be undone. And for Phyllis and Tessa, the path ahead was filled with uncertainty, danger, and the very real possibility that everything they had fought to protect could be lost in an instant. The fallout didn't explode all at once, it crept in, subtle and suffocating, like a slow-burning fire that refused to be extinguished. In the days following the confrontation, Tessa found herself trapped in a state of constant anxiety, her every move shadowed by the memory of Phyllis's warning. She couldn't shake the image of that moment, the fury in Phyllis's eyes, the cold certainty in her voice when she delivered the threat. It played on a loop in her mind, invading her thoughts at the most unexpected times, making it impossible to feel safe, even in the places that had once brought her comfort. Sleep became a luxury she could no longer afford. Every time she closed her eyes, she was pulled back into that room, reliving the slap, the humiliation, the fear. And worst of all was the silence that followed, the unspoken understanding that everything had changed. Tessa tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, to go about her routine as if nothing had happened, but it was a fragile illusion. The people around her noticed the difference, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, the hesitation in her voice, the subtle tension in her posture whenever Phyllis's name was mentioned. Questions began to surface, gentle at first, then more persistent as concern turned into suspicion. Mariah, especially, sensed that something was wrong. She knew Tessa better than anyone, and the distance that had suddenly formed between them was impossible to ignore. There were moments when Mariah would catch Tessa staring off into space, lost in thought, her expression clouded with something that looked a lot like fear. Each time, Tessa would brush it off with a weak excuse, insisting she was just tired or stressed, but the explanations were wearing thin. Meanwhile, Phyllis was navigating her own carefully constructed reality, one where control was everything and vulnerability was a weakness she refused to acknowledge. On the surface, she appeared composed, even confident, as if the confrontation had resolved the issue once and for all. But beneath that facade, there was a growing sense of unease that she couldn't quite suppress. She knew Tessa was a wild card, an unpredictable element that could undo everything with a single decision. And while the threat she had issued was meant to keep Tessa in line, Phyllis understood that fear was not a permanent solution, it was a temporary measure, one that could just as easily backfire if pushed too far. She found herself watching Tessa more closely than she cared to admit, analyzing every interaction, every glance, every subtle shift in behavior. It became an obsession, one that consumed her thoughts and dictated her actions. She justified it as a necessary precaution, a way to protect what mattered, but deep down, she couldn't ignore the truth, she was losing control. And for someone like Phyllis, that was unacceptable. As the tension between them continued to build, the rest of Genoa City began to feel the impact in ways both big and small. Conversations would abruptly stop when either of them entered a room, replaced by awkward silence and exchanged glances. Rumors spread like wildfire, fueled by speculation and half-truths, each version more dramatic than the last. Some believed it was a personal betrayal, others suspected something far more sinister, but no one had the full picture. And that uncertainty only added to the growing sense of unease that hung over the community. Tessa reached a breaking point one evening when she found herself alone, the weight of everything finally becoming too much to bear. She sat in silence, her thoughts racing, her heart pounding, as she considered her options. The secret she had been protecting no longer felt like something she could carry on her own. It had become a burden, a constant source of fear and anxiety that was slowly eroding her sense of self. She thought about telling the truth, about freeing herself from the hold it had over her, but the consequences were impossible to ignore. Phyllis's words echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder of what was at stake. But then, something shifted. It wasn't a sudden realization or a moment of clarity, but rather a quiet, growing determination that began to take root within her. She was tired of being afraid, tired of living under the shadow of someone else's power. For the first time since the confrontation, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that she had more control than she thought. That maybe, just maybe, the threat didn't have to define her choices. At the same time, Phyllis was facing a challenge of her own. The cracks in her carefully maintained composure were becoming harder to hide, and the pressure of keeping everything under control was starting to take its toll. She found herself snapping at people over minor issues, her patience wearing thin as the stress continued to build. Even those closest to her began to notice the change, the edge in her voice, the intensity in her gaze. It was only a matter of time before someone started asking the right questions. The inevitable confrontation came sooner than either of them expected. It wasn't planned, and it certainly wasn't controlled. It happened in a moment of heightened emotion, when the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiled over. Tessa, no longer willing to remain silent, stood her ground as Phyllis approached her once again, her presence as imposing as ever. But this time, something was different. There was no hesitation, no fear in Tessa's eyes, only resolve. Phyllis noticed it immediately, and it caught her off guard. She had expected resistance, maybe even defiance, but not this quiet strength that seemed to radiate from Tessa. It unsettled her in a way she hadn't anticipated, forcing her to reconsider the dynamic she had worked so hard to establish. The power she thought she held suddenly felt less certain, less absolute. Their exchange was tense, every word carefully chosen, every glance loaded with meaning. Tessa didn't reveal the secret, not yet, but she made it clear that she wasn't going to be controlled anymore. It was a subtle shift, but a significant one, and it changed everything. For the first time, Phyllis realized that the situation was no longer entirely in her hands. The aftermath of that moment sent shockwaves through both of them. Tessa felt a sense of empowerment she hadn't experienced before, a newfound confidence that gave her the strength to face whatever came next. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that the truth still had the potential to cause immense damage, but she also understood that living in fear was no longer an option. Phyllis, on the other hand, was forced to confront a reality she had been trying to avoid. Control was slipping through her fingers, and no amount of threats or intimidation could guarantee the outcome she wanted. She was standing on unstable ground, and the choices she made moving forward would determine whether she could regain her footing or fall even further. As the story continued to unfold, the sense of impending revelation grew stronger. The secret at the center of it all remained hidden, but its presence was undeniable. Genoa City was on the brink of something explosive, a turning point that would reshape relationships and redefine loyalties. The confrontation between Phyllis and Tessa had set the stage, but the real drama was yet to come. And as both women prepared for what lay ahead, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The sense that something irreversible was approaching settled over Genoa City like a gathering storm, thick and electric, impossible to ignore no matter how hard anyone tried to carry on as usual. Tessa could feel it in every whispered conversation that abruptly stopped when she walked into a room, in every curious glance that lingered just a second too long, in every moment of silence that seemed heavier than it should have been. The world around her hadn't changed on the surface. People still went to work, shared drinks, laughed at familiar jokes, but underneath it all, there was a shift, subtle yet undeniable. It was as if the truth she carried had begun to seep through the cracks, reaching people in ways she couldn't fully understand or control. For Tessa, the pressure had become almost unbearable. The brief moment of courage she had found during her last confrontation with Phyllis still lingered, but it was now tangled with a new, more complicated emotion: inevitability. She was beginning to accept that the secret wouldn't stay buried forever, not because she would necessarily reveal it, but because secrets like this had a way of finding the light, no matter how deeply they were hidden. And that realization brought with it a strange mixture of fear and relief. Fear, because she knew the fallout would be devastating. Relief, because it meant the constant weight pressing down on her might finally be lifted. But she also understood that timing mattered. How the truth came out, who revealed it, and under what circumstances could make all the difference between damage that could be managed and destruction that couldn't be undone. That thought consumed her more than anything else. She didn't just want to be free of the secret, she wanted to control its release, to shape the narrative in a way that might soften the blow for everyone involved. It was a risky plan, one that required careful thought and even more careful execution, but it was the only option that felt like it gave her any real power. Meanwhile, Phyllis was unraveling in ways she refused to acknowledge out loud. To anyone watching, she still appeared sharp, calculating, and firmly in control, but beneath that polished exterior, her thoughts had become increasingly chaotic. She couldn't stop thinking about Tessa's change in demeanor, the quiet strength, the absence of fear, the way she had stood her ground without backing down. It wasn't just unexpected, it was dangerous. Because it meant that the threat Phyllis had relied on was losing its effectiveness, and without that leverage, everything she had tried to contain was at risk of spiraling out of control. She began to question her own decisions, replaying the confrontation in her mind just as Tessa had, but from a completely different perspective. Had she pushed too hard? Had she revealed too much? Had she underestimated Tessa's resilience? These were questions Phyllis didn't like asking herself, because they hinted at something she hated even more than losing control, the possibility that she had made a mistake. And if there was one thing Phyllis couldn't tolerate, it was the idea that her own actions might be the very thing that brought everything crashing down. As the days passed, the tension between them became impossible to ignore. Their interactions were few, but when they did cross paths, the air seemed to crackle with unspoken conflict. There was no more pretense of normalcy, no polite exchanges or forced civility. Everything between them was raw, exposed, and teetering on the edge of explosion. It was during one of these encounters that the situation took a decisive turn. They found themselves alone again, the setting eerily similar to the place where everything had first gone wrong. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, thick with memory and meaning, until Tessa finally broke it, not with hesitation, but with purpose. "I can't keep doing this," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion behind it. Phyllis's eyes narrowed slightly, her instincts immediately going on high alert. Doing what? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Living like this. Being afraid of what might happen if I say the wrong thing, or talk to the wrong person, or even just exist in the same space as you. Tessa took a step forward, her gaze unwavering. I'm done being controlled. The words landed harder than any slap ever could. For a split second, something flickered across Phyllis's face, anger, yes, but also something deeper, something more uncertain. But it was gone almost instantly, replaced by the familiar steeliness she relied on to maintain her composure. You think you have a choice? Phyllis shot back, her voice low and dangerous. You think you can just decide you're done and walk away from this?